Good morning. This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to today's hearing titled Vendors in the OR, VA's Failed Oversight of Surgical Implants. This hearing examines serious problems with the tracking and handling of surgical implants within the VA and follows through on procurement issues revealed in a previous hearing by this subcommittee. According to multiple sources, VA medical centers have allowed surgical implant vendors to participate in hands-on treatment administered to veterans. Based on my staff's initial findings, I asked GAO to investigate these allegations regarding veteran health care and to determine what policies are currently in place. GAO substantiated that several veterans had received skin grafts that had been applied directly by skin graft vendors. GAO found that VHA requires each medical facility to develop its own policy on vendor access, resulting in varying degrees of specificity regarding their participation in patient care. These findings raise serious questions about the extent of vendor involvement in patient care at VA facilities and the lack of clear guidance regarding vendor access. VA's own consent form, as well as industry best practices, state that vendor representatives may be present to provide technical advice but may not physically participate in the procedure. However, GAO's investigation confirms that these policies are being unevenly applied or unenforced. Clearly, national guidance and oversight is necessary to protect veterans who undergo surgical implant procedures. There are also significant problems with how VA handles and tracks surgical implants in veterans. Previous VA OIG audits criticized the VHA for weak internal controls that jeopardize VA's ability to identify and notify patients in the event of FDA product recall. According to GAO's report, released on Monday, these concerns remain and have not been remedied. For some clinical specialties, including gastroenterology, interventional radiology, and pulmonary, identifying information on implants was not tracked in any system. It is troubling to consider that for these specialties, VHA was unable to verify that the items purchased were actually implanted in the patients for whom they were intended. In 2008, VA began developing the Veterans Implant Tracking and Alert System, VISTAS, to track and retrieve identifying information, including the lot and serial number of surgical implants placed in patients VHA-wide. Unfortunately, according to GAO, this system's development was suspended at the end of the fiscal year 2012 due to data reliability challenges, and as of December 2013, development of VISTAS has not resumed, limiting VHA's ability to identify and locate patients who have received implants. Additionally, GAO's report shows that VA has failed to make sufficient progress with prosthetic procurement reform. In a May 30th, 2012 hearing, this subcommittee revealed that VA medical centers and VHA regional network contracting officers misuse waiving authority to spend nearly $3 billion on open market purchases of prosthetics, including surgical implants, rather than procure them through competitive contracts, including those with businesses on the federal supply schedule. As a result of the hearing, VA acknowledged that there are often several options available for implants and that disadvantaged veteran-owned small businesses and others offering these products were being unfairly excluded from consideration. VA indicated that it would implement reforms so that non-competitive and sole source purchases will require justification on a case-by-case basis. GAO's report does contain some good news. VA has made some progress with obtaining national committed use contracts for non-biological implants, such as artificial joints, cardiac pacemakers, heart valves, and coronary stents. Use of these national committed use contracts is the most favored method of procurement for implants under the Federal Acquisition Regulations. However, GAO also reported that no such contracts have been negotiated for biological implants such as skin and bone grafts. Moreover, contrary to a memorandum dated May 23, 2012, from Assistant Deputy Undersecretary Matkovsky, GAO found biological implants were rarely ordered from the Federal Supply Schedule at each VA medical center it visited. According to GAO, overuse of the waiver process continues. They reported that none of the medical centers it visited procured surgical implants in compliance with waiver requirements for open market purchases. Finally, it is most disappointing to note that while VA and VHA now have procurement oversight components, GAO reported that they have failed to impose corrective actions for these deficiencies. In conclusion, VA must continue to implement reforms so that medical centers procure surgical implants that meet patient needs while also ensuring best value. More importantly, VA and VHA must pay much better attention to patient safety concerns regarding surgical implants. It is way past time for VA to develop national policies that set forth the parameters for vendor access to treatment facilities that implement sufficient oversight controls. Additionally, proper tracking of surgical implants is a problem that has been unresolved for far too long, and it must be remedied post-haste. With that, I now recognize Ranking Member Kirkpatrick for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate having this hearing on the purchase and use of surgical implants. As we know, it's common for the vendors of medical devices to be in the operating room during surgery, but it's very uncommon for them to scrub and to touch a patient. So I'm really interested in the testimony today and whether or not we need to actually beef up our policies on this. On Monday, the Government Accountability Office released a report entitled VA Surgical Implants, Purchase Requirements Were Not Always Followed at Selected Medical Centers and Oversight Needs to be Improved. So that's what we're concerned about today. The GA looked at 4 VA medical centers and found that these hospitals did not always follow VHA policy regarding documenting open market purchases of surgical implants, including obtaining the necessary waivers to purchase items not covered by a VA negotiated contract. Last year, VA instituted a new policy regarding purchases above the Federal Acquisition Regulations, FAR, micro purchase threshold of $3,000 and below the simplified acquisition threshold of $150,000. Medical facility and regional office officials attributed noncompliance mainly to insufficient VHA guidance and VA staff's inexperience in completing the new requirements. This is a familiar litany to members serving on this subcommittee. It has been noted before that it does not matter how good and thorough the policy and standards are if no one follows them and there are seemingly no consequences for noncompliance. This is what I would like to explore today, in addition to looking at the specific allegations and looking at ways to improve the process. Surgical implants and the larger issue of medical procurement provides us with a classic balancing act of patient and provider choice on one hand and efficiency and savings on the other. These are not, in my view, mutually exclusive concepts, but also they are ultimately Very few easy answers. Should there be a greater level of centralization on procurement, or should we provide greater local autonomy while ensuring the policies are followed? Indeed, how do we ensure that VA employees are provided the tools to do their job and help our veterans, but are also held accountable if they do not comply with established policies? On the issue of surgical implants, what policies and structures are in place to ensure that VA staff is kept fully up to date on advances in the field of surgical implants and the availability of different options, while also ensuring that VA's contracting efforts are directed toward items that are clinically advantageous and necessary for patient care? Are decisions regarding which items to include in a VA negotiated committed use contract made from the top down or the bottom up? And more importantly, are these decisions made rigorously and systematically? How effective is the recently instituted program executive office, and does this effort have the staffing level and financial resources to make a difference and improve the process? GAO reported that VHA spent approximately $563 million on surgical implants in fiscal year 2012. That's an increase of 28% over the 2008 levels. I would like to hear from our witnesses today regarding the factors that led to this increase. It is not clear to me whether the increase is primarily due to the practice of open market purchases or to an increase in either the cost of surgical implant or an increase in their use. Patient care and safety is our #1 concern. That is why I'm concerned over allegations that surgical implant vendors' representatives participated in direct patient care. I want to ensure that the VA policies are fully followed in this regard, while also recognizing that at times, vendor representatives can have an important role in providing technical assistance and education to VA care providers. So let us begin the conversation on how best to fix the problems before us today and work to improve the VA healthcare system and the healthcare it provides to our veterans. Spending taxpayer dollars wisely is essential, but providing the healthcare that veterans have earned and deserved is critical. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick. I ask that all members waive their opening remarks as per this committee's custom. With that, I invite the first panel, who are now at the witness table. On this panel, we will hear from Mr. Randall Williamson, Director of the Healthcare Team at the Government Accountability Office. He will be accompanied by Mr. Wayne McElrath, Director of GAO's Forensic Audit and Investigative Services Team. We will also hear from Mr. Roscoe Butler, Assistant Director for Healthcare with the National Veterans Affairs and Rehabilitation Commission at the American Legion. Your complete written statements will be made part of the hearing record. Mr. Williamson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's recent report on VA's purchasing of surgical implants. Surgical implants include biological implants such as skin and bone grafts, and non-biological implants such as cardiac pacemakers and artificial joints. Today I will address 3 areas of our work. First, VA's compliance with federal purchasing requirements and its oversight of surgical implant purchasing. Second, VA's ability to identify veterans who have had surgical implants that are recalled by the manufacturer or the Food and Drug Administration. And third, allegations that surgical implant vendor representatives participated in direct patient care at VAMCs. With me today is Wayne McElrath, who directed our investigative work on vendor participation in surgical procedures at 3 VAMCs. Regarding VA's compliance with purchasing requirements, we found through our work at selected VAMCs that VA surgical implant purchase requirements were not always followed. For example, when surgical implants are purchased on the open market and not through established VA and government-wide negotiated contracts where prices have been specifically established, VAMCs are required to file a waiver justifying why the item is being purchased on the open market. We found that in many cases, such waivers were not being obtained or had incomplete documentation. We also found that in justifying open market purchases of surgical implants over $3,000, VAMCs are not always preparing a written determination that prices are fair and reasonable, and or citing an appropriate rationale for sole source award. We found that oversight over surgical implant purchases was not robust and allowed these conditions to persist at VAMCs. Turning now to VA's ability to identify veterans who have received recalled surgical implants, we found that VA is limited in its ability to systematically identify and locate all patients who receive surgical implants, which could be a critical factor if an implant is recalled by the manufacturer or the FDA because of safety concerns. For example, VA, through its own studies, has found instances at numerous VAMCs where data on lot and serial numbers for surgical implants were not entered into VA's computerized system for tracking such purchases. This limits VAMC's ability to match veterans to implants that they received. Absent the ability to accurately track implants to veterans receiving them, VA may be putting some veterans at risk in the event that surgical implants are recalled. In 2008, VA began developing a new tracking system to remedy this problem. But VA's efforts to develop such a system are currently stalled due to technical challenges and a lack of funding. Finally, our investigations of allegations received by the subcommittee disclose that in some instances, a vendor representative supplying surgical implants to one of the 3 VAMCs we investigated was participating in direct patient care at that facility. Specifically, at least as recently as August 2013, a vendor was assisting VA clinicians in applying skin grafts or was himself applying skin grafts to several veterans. Without proper precautions, allowing vendor representatives to participate in direct patient care could compromise veteran safety. While VA allows vendors to provide technical assistance and advice during procedures involving surgical implants, national VA policies do not adequately define the degree that vendors are allowed to participate in patient care. Rather, VA relies on VAMCs themselves to develop their own procedures in this regard. Absent definitive national guidelines, VAMCs, acting alone, may develop different and inconsistent guidelines and controls over vendors, which is exactly what we found at the 3 locations we investigated. For example, 2 VAMCs required background screening for vendors accessing the facilities, while the 3rd VAMC did not. Also, at 1 VAMC, written procedures covering vendor access and involvement in clinical procedures expressly prohibits vendors from physically performing any part of a clinical procedure, whereas written procedures for the other 2 hospitals are silent in this regard. Also, we found instances where some VAMCs were not following their own written procedures. While the results of our findings cannot be generalized to VA as a whole, they raise serious questions about the extent that consistent procedures and controls exist with respect to both vendor access to VA facilities and vendor involvement in patient care at facilities nationwide. This concludes my opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Thank you, Mr. Williamson. Mr. Butler, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Ranking Member Kirkpatrick and members of the committee, on behalf of our National Commander, Dan Dellinger, and the 2.4 million members of the American Legion, I want to thank you for inviting our organization here today to this hearing to address our concerns with aspects of how VA implements their prosthetic and implant medicine program. As a member of the American Legion System Worth Saving Task Force, I have been privileged to travel to many VA healthcare facilities and see firsthand how programs really work in the field. In both my experience working for VA for many years and in my travel on behalf of the American Legion, I have seen that conditions in the field don't always match what the folks inside the Beltway think they are. There are several problems with VHA policies and implementation of in-plant medicine healthcare. Most of these problems could be fixed with clear written direction from central office and better oversight and consequences to enforce compliance. First, VA still has a problem tracking surgical implants that places veterans at risk. An OIG audit from 2 years ago identified that there are expired surgical devices on VA supply shelves. Further, GAO report and testimony today indicated that VA has an inaccurate tracking capability in recording the serial numbers of the implant surgical devices. The grave concern of the American Legion is that in addition to having expired products on the shelves, veterans potentially could be walking around today with expired surgical implants. The American Legion urges Congress to require VA to implement an automated tracking system that addresses vulnerabilities by, 1, initially recording the serial number of a surgical implant device when procured and placed into VA's inventory, 2, record the expiration date, and 3, that a record tracking flag be put into place to alert VA staff when the product is near its expiration date. As there remain limitations to VA's current supply inventory system and uncertainty surrounding the safety and well-being of veterans currently with implantable devices, the American Legion urges VA to verify that there are no veterans with expired surgical implants and accelerate its timeline to implementing a new prosthetic inventory system that includes these recommendations. Secondly, the American Legion remains concerned that VA does not have an official policy on vendors in operating rooms. While having vendors in the OR to provide technical advice may be medically necessary, it needs to be made crystal clear that veterans have consented and received full disclosure that strictly adheres to a clear, delineated VA policy. VA has admitted that they do not have a specific policy, but indicated the National Center for Ethics in Healthcare noted that the presence of vendors in the operating room is a common practice in U.S. healthcare, and when there are broadly accepted professional ethics standards pertaining to a particular practice, VA does not particularly reiterate those standards in VA policy. Rather, it was buried in VA's consent. And regulatory authorities. Third, the American Legion has concern about VA making a regular practice of circumventing the supply schedule. The federal supply schedule exists for a reason, and the vendors on the schedule have been carefully vetted. Many of them are important contracts with veterans and/or small disabled veteran-owned business owners. While the American Legion recognizes and applauds the need to go off schedule in rare circumstances for the medical interests of the patient, it is becoming increasingly disturbing that off-schedule purchases seem to be more the norm than the exception. Let's be clear. The medical health of the veteran is the single most important factor in any decision about health care in the system. System worth-saving visits uncover doctors who choose to go off schedule to order stents for heart surgery because they were uncomfortable with the durability and safety of the stents on the schedule. In that circumstance, you would hope that the doctor err on the side of the patient's safety 100% of the time. That said, if doctors are consistently going off schedule, then either the schedule needs to be reformed or the process reform. No system that is based on circumventing its own process can be considered in anyone's best interest. Again, thank you for the invitation to speak today and keeping a close focus on ensuring veterans get the most out of their healthcare system. We would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. McElrath, was GAO able to determine why vendor representatives were allowed to provide potentially inappropriate patient care at the VAMC where the allegations were substantiated?
We weren't able to identify one specific reason, but some of the rationales that were given were a lack of staffing, the difficulty in placing grafts on patients without having some assistance, and also a lack of knowledge relative to the particular VMAC's policies and procedures.
Sure. Mr. Williamson, based on your report, please elaborate on the challenges in trying to identify veterans who may have received a recalled surgical implant.
Currently, VA has a prosthetics purchasing tracking system, or purchasing system, which is used to track surgical implants and match them with veterans as well. That system, VA has done a study of that system and found that lot and serial numbers were oftentimes not entered correctly, or not entered at all, but mostly not correctly, and that really is a detraction in trying to match veterans with implants. Also, VA has clinical services within VA have their own systems. Oftentimes, VAMCs or clinical services themselves will design systems. The spreadsheets, perhaps, kept on a computer. But the difficulty with those is they're not standardized, and that information is not shared among VAMCs. So you have augmenting systems. VA is developing a new system called the Veteran Implant Tracking and Alert System. It's called VITAS, and that is designed to centralize that. The difficulty is it still relies on input, and the chance of human error is still there. And VITAS will be, have the same kind of difficulty in the sense that it's inputted by people. A way to get around that is to have a barcoding system where you scan the barcode in and it's put in automatically, and that would solve the problem. VITAS is not going that route right now.
Okay.
So those are the challenges.
Thank you. Mr. Butler, did you find that VHA had clear and consistent policy set forth to ensure a proper and ethical procedure when vendors were present during surgery?
We asked VA if they could provide us a copy of their policy, and their response was that they did not have a specific policy. However, the consent was included, the authorization was included in their consent form. So this concerns us that they're using guidance from the National Office of Ethics, but they themselves have not promulgated a standard policy that can be applied consistently across the board throughout VA or VHA.
Thank you. Ranking Member Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Williamson, you probably don't know, but the committee knows that I have over 20 years experience in a hospital, and I'm really interested in hearing from our physician members of the committee about this, but it's highly unusual for a rep to scrub in the OR, and in the instances that you mentioned, did the rep scrub?
You want to take that?
Yes. We were talking about instances, or the instances that we identify was the application of biologics or skin grafts. The interviews that we conducted didn't mention the words specifically scrubbing in, but the wound care nurse and the vendor representative actually performed the procedure.
So the nurse actually, the clinician actually performed the procedure, not the rep?
No. From the patient care record, the wound care nurse indicated that the vendor actually applied the skin graft.
Okay, that's very disturbing. Can you tell us what that was?
Out of respect for the investigative process and the fact that we may be making referral to the VA Office of Inspector General for further investigation, we would respectfully request that we provide that information to your committee staff after the hearing.
Thank you. Please do. Looking at the overall goal of cost saving and clinician choice, Mr. Williamson, again, I'd like to know how effective is the VHA's program executive office? And do you have ideas for us about how to strengthen and utilize that office?
We didn't look at that specific thing in general, but I think if you want to bring in the idea of I know in the past the subcommittee is very concerned about the use of Section 8123 and whether that's being overused and whatever. And that's certainly something that we looked at in the purchases that we examined during our review. We see that the use of, at least on the surface, the use of 8123 is going down. And used prudently, that is a good avenue for a physician or a clinician to use to provide treatment, the best treatment that he or she sees fit for a veteran. But we noted when we looked at the justifications for sole source procurement that there's much greater use of urgent, compelling, or emergency kind of things, like it's justified based on urgency, the need for that right away, as opposed to 8123. And so we just see kind of a flop. 8123's, that box not being checked anymore, but urgent and compelling need is. So I think that from that standpoint, the efficiency and some of the things that we see there could be improved.
Those of us who have experience in healthcare know that the medical device industry changes quickly. There are always new devices coming out. And did you look at the training that the clinicians have in terms of educating them on the best products, the best use? Did you look at all about adequacy of training?
Are you talking about the clinicians or the
clinicians?
Clinicians? Yeah. We did not. We have in the past done some fairly thorough studies of credentialing and privileging systems that both VA and DoD have. We did not look at that training during this review.
Mr. Butler, did you look at that at all?
We did not.
You did not. Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back. I'd really want to hear from our physicians on the committee.
Dr. Hulskamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am a doctor but not a physician, so there'll be no confusion here. But I do have some questions, particularly of the GAO, and I apologize for my voice this morning. You made some mention to the issue of urgency and perhaps timeliness as far as the purchases on the open market versus those through the VA purchasing requirements. Did you compare cost or quality or any other characteristics? I see you looked at a certain percentage of those. I didn't know if you compared the outcomes and the costs and such.
Could you repeat the last part of the question again?
You mentioned you compared a few purchases, about I believe 6% of a certain subset. Did you look at the cost? Was it more or less expensive? Did you look at the quality? Was there any timeliness as far as comparing those purchases in those two environments?
Yeah, we did not look at whether they got the best price. What we did was rather focus on the documentation and see whether that existed. And in many cases, it did not exist to our satisfaction.
Yeah, and I didn't see that in the report. That's how I wanted to ask. The follow-up question would be, what is the penalty for failing to comply with the VHA purchasing requirements?
Well, they're also governed by the federal acquisition requirements, and I don't know if that's a criminal. Possible criminal, I don't think it is, but it's certainly something that can cause a reprimand within the agency.
Any evidence that there was any reprimand or any penalties for?
No, I mean a lot of times when waivers are not obtained, when the reasonableness of the price is not obtained, it was not followed up on, and there was no action plan to correct those kind of weaknesses.
Sure.
No.
Okay. The next question would be, I see your experience of working with the health systems and the Department of Defense as well. Could you give a broad comparison between VA and the DoD? Do they have these similar problems? And are you familiar with that enough to answer?
We haven't looked at similar issues like surgical implants and DoD. If that's what you're talking about, no, we haven't. We did look at how, we did talk to some large healthcare systems like Kaiser on the private sector and try to find out from a standpoint of how they go about putting surgical implants under their contracts, and they're much more aggressive than VA has been in trying to get items under contract.
Mm-hmm. But you didn't look at the cost comparison?
No.
Okay. The last question would be for Mr. Butler, and I'm very concerned about the patient privacy and the instances that were repeated here, and we do not know how often it's occurring, but what are your suggestions? What should be able to be authorized by a patient? If I understood correctly, you believe the language that was used probably authorized the vendor to be in the care situation. Is that your understanding?
No, it doesn't authorize, the language in their consent form doesn't authorize the vendor to provide hands-on care. It authorizes the vendor to provide technical advice. But that is a contract between the vendor and the patient. It's not a national policy. So we advocate that the VA establish a national policy that articulates all of the requirements for allowing vendors in the OR, and then use the consent form as the agreement between the vendor and the patient. We believe that if they have a national policy, that, as I stated, the foundation of VA is predicated upon the statute, the regulations, and the policy that VA adopts. And without a policy, there's no requirements that facilities operate in a consistent manner or fashion.
Well, thank you, Mr. Butler. I agree as well, and I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Benishek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a general surgeon, and I've been in the operating room lots of times. I've never actually seen a vendor, do a case. So, Mr. McElrath, was this a couple instances of some vendor putting on a skin graft? Is that what you're saying? Is there any other episodes that you encountered that the vendor was involved with the case, or is it a couple?
We found 2 cases where vendors were actually involved, but there were several instances over a period of time. And speaking to our clinicians that we interviewed during the course of this investigation, we were able to identify those records. If the clinicians had not input that information directly into the patient record, all we would have was witness testimonies. It made it easier for us to corroborate their statements because they actually entered into the patient record who placed the skin graft.
Well, it's frankly shocking to me that this actually happened. I'm a little concerned about, standards that come from Washington to every VA, because all that stuff gets messed. But it seems to me that each hospital should have rules, like the Joint Commission on Hospital Accreditation would not go for this. I mean, this would not fulfill the accreditation needs of any hospital that I know of. And, I think that rules should be developed at the hospital, but they should be, reasonable rules. And I can't believe that, something must have been wrong. I mean, Mr. Williamson, you said some of the hospitals had no rules about?
The 3 we looked at had written procedures, but those procedures were inconsistent, and they left out some of the things that
Well, in my experience, which is in the private sector mostly, but I've had some experience in the VA system as well. Each hospital is required to have a set of rules and procedures, to be accredited by the Joint Commission.
Right.
Which sets a standard for not only the VA but for private sector hospitals, which I hope that the VA would be in the same boat. And the VA I worked at, were inspected, and this type of stuff I think would fall out of an inspection, immediately if they were aware of it. What can we do? I guess the problem to me is accountability. I mean, nobody at the problem I come up again and again at this committee is that when errors like this are found, nobody seems responsible. There's not one individual that you could point to and say, this was your responsibility and you need to be reprimanded or change your ways, get put in your performance review. Has any of that occurred in any of these circumstances that you know of?
You're talking about the vendor?
Well, no, I'm talking about the hospital people that allow this to happen. I mean, you know, you never get to a person whose responsibility it was, then they get identified. You know, a report is placed in their performance review saying that, you know, they did not comply with the rules of the hospital, and, you know, you may be subject to termination, you may be subject to disciplinary action. The accountability of the administration of the hospital or, you know, the upper echelons is always of importance to me because it seems to never happen where one person gets identified as being the problem. And, you know, a culture of lackadaisical performance seems to be allowed a lot of the time within the VA. So as far as you know, has anybody been disciplined or had a report placed in their...
No.
Well, we'll ask the VA too, but I just was hoping that maybe you guys could... Let me also ask about this vendor or the purchase of these materials. You know, as a surgeon, I want to work with the materials and the devices that I'm familiar with.
Right.
Okay, so sometimes I would be upset that the VA would, you know, they want to use this thing which I never used, and I'm not comfortable with it. So I want to have the implant or, you know, the device that I'm comfortable with and used to using. And I think that many surgeons have that same, you know, preference.
You're correct.
But there's no reason why when you come to the hospital and set up, you can tell them what you're going to use. And they should be able to set up a plan to purchase that, you know, in a price advantageous. And I think that's a problem. And I think that's a problem related to how this is working here, because surgeon comes in, the VA won't put it on their formulary for whatever reason, and the guy said, well, I'm not doing the case unless I get the stuff that I'm familiar with. So is there any evidence of that happening?
Well, when we went out to the hospitals, four different hospitals across the country to look at this, we interviewed 28 clinicians. We asked them that very question. Why do you choose surgical implants from the open market, in many cases, when these are on contract? And it comes down to, number one, the best interest of the patient. In other words, they sometimes have unique needs, and they have implants that best suit the treatment needs of them. The other is, again, like you say, what are you comfortable in using? What have you been trained on in terms of the surgical implant? Also, the literature searches that you might have access to in terms of the effectiveness of these, and the contacts with vendors.
Well, that doesn't preclude the ability of the VA to enter into contracts with people that provide a myriad of different devices. I mean, there's lots of VAs across the country. You know, there may be 10 different devices, and, you know, 100 different surgeons may use each one of those differently.
Right.
So I don't see how that doesn't preclude the ability for the VA to contract with multiple providers for the same type of implant. And that doesn't seem to be happening.
No, the key, you're right, the key is to get more items under contract to get a good price.
Right.
Right now we only have, under national committed use contracts that VA has with vendors, that we only have 9 surgical implants on those national contracts. And one of the things that we recommended was that VA take a more aggressive posture, and
There's only 9?
only 9 all non-biological implants.
Out of the thousands of implants, different types of implants.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're the highest. I will say that
That's
they
a
are
shocking number. To tell
high
you
volume,
the truth,
high cost
Williamson,
items.
because that's a very small number of the different implants that it happens. That's a major deficiency that I think you've identified here at a high level within the VA, because there should be 1,000 different implants on the VA formulary. You know, so
Now, there are, in addition to the national committed use contracts, there's the federal supply schedule contracts, and there are a number of both biological and non-biological surgical implants on that. So there are their lists to choose from. But the first choice would be the national committed use contracts, because those give you the best prices.
my time has expired. Thank you.
Congressman Walorski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Williamson, the information is just shocking. And every time we sit in these oversight committee hearings with these reports, which I very much appreciate, it's just shocking, I think, to the American taxpayer and to all of us sitting here who want to provide the absolute finest services to our best and brightest servicemen and women, and to hear these kind of reports. And I guess, one question I have is, it just is shocking to me that there's national medical device tracking efforts already. Would it not behoove the VA to look at something that's already in place if they obviously have not been able to successfully track implants, like the UDI?
I don't think there is any. I don't think that necessarily would provide the information they need on surgical implants. I think that the trouble is there is no centralized system right now. The prosthetics purchasing system has some weaknesses, as I reiterated in my opening remarks. And they're trying to, in addition to that, there are a number of other smaller systems that the clinics, the surgical services are using on their own. So there's two sets of books here.
Is there a barcode system set up in the
No.
VA where those implants are just barcoded?
Not to my knowledge, no. That would take away the human error, and that would probably be the best system. That a system based on something like that would be the best system.
And what about the FDA's UDI system, or what about the American Joint Replacement Registry, AJRR, or something as simple as just having some kind of a standardized policy of a scanner where it's literally just scanned into a system that tracks?
Yeah, I mean that would be something that could be considered. It's a scanning system. It alleviates.
So what happens when we see a recall of some specific device that's been implanted and it's affected X amount of people? How do they know if that's implanted in a veteran?
Well, you've got to rely on your systems that you have already and identify through serial numbers, lot numbers, medical records, other kinds of things.
But when human error puts a wrong code or wrong
well, then I'm not saying it's impossible, because if it was a recall, there are ways to do it. Certainly going through the medical records, but that's a long, laborious project, and it is also subject to human error. Would somebody detect it as they're going through all that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Dr. Rowe?
Thank you, Chairman, for yielding, and thank you for this testimony. Let me just, having been involved in a lot of devices and having an implantable device in my eye right now, and I actually can read your name, something I couldn't do before my device was implanted. I would like to go about how the procedure, how this actually works in the private sector, and Dr. Benechek alluded to it. Let's say uterine ablation or any other new procedure that comes out. As a surgeon, you have to go and be trained. There are standards in your hospital that require a certain number of hours of training before you can do that. And there may be some technical assistance in the operating room if you're operating a piece of machinery or whatever that you need a vendor there for.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree that the vendor has no place in actually doing the procedure. You as the surgeon are trained to do that procedure, and the technical advice there are just things that come up that happen during the procedure. So I certainly understand the need, and Ms. Kirkpatrick clearly pointed out, these changes are happening at light speed. Now, I would be very uneasy if I knew that this device in my left eye couldn't be kept up with, that we didn't know that there was some reason it couldn't be tracked, because, as you know, and it's mostly in orthopedics, that's where most of the implants are, that sometimes these fail. And if you find a behavior of failure throughout these, you'd like to be able to track down the patients and tell them that, hey, this device has some risk to you or could do this, look out for these symptoms. As a physician, I would want to be able to inform my patients that had happened. So the way it worked in our hospital is when the new procedure came out, you had to have a certain amount of training, be certified in that procedure, and then carry out that procedure a number of times, and then many times I would mentor other people, teach them how to do the procedure. And the old saying in years gone by, see one, do one, teach one, that's sort of gone by the wayside now. you're absolutely right. A system, whether it's barcoding, that's the simplest thing in the world. I mean, Walmart can tell you how many bars of soap went out of Walmart in Tennessee. You ought to be able to keep up with a lens implant or a knee implant and find out who they are. That technology is there. It's not new. So I think those kinds of things are fairly simple. And I don't believe that we have a problem here that can be easily solved with the systems that are in place. And maybe it'll require a new IT. I don't know, Mr. Williamson, whether it will or won't, or whether those current systems are available. But this is not new. I mean, we've been doing this for 25 years, and we're going to continue to do it. And especially as our population ages and more implantable procedures are done. I mean, how many people have you met now that can't go through an airport because they set off the metal detector? They've had so many devices implanted in them. And we have to have a way to track those, because not all of them are perfect. There's no question about it. And the reason it's important to be able to track those is because when you find out what those defects are, it gives the manufacturer and the engineers a chance to improve those and make them better for future patients. So, I mean, I think, Ms. Kirkpatrick, I know your background, and I certainly believe what we've got here is, and I agree with Dr. Benechek, I'm not sure we need a national policy, but each hospital, that's fairly simple stuff. And I will yield to anyone who wants to respond. Mr. Butler, I read your testimony and agree with much of it, but again, this is not reinventing the wheel.
If I may,
yes, sir.
With regard to your comment about the national policy, the local hospitals develop their local policies based upon the national guidance from the central office. So if they don't have national guidance from central office, their local policies may be inconsistent from one facility to the next. So there needs to be consistency across all the VA healthcare system, and that consistency comes from the national guidance provided by the program office out of D.C.
I certainly, I can't argue with that. Some consistency. The other thing I think that we get into as surgeons, and I get this. You know, I like a certain type of suture. Is it Vicryl? Is it chromic? Is it whatever? Do I like staples? Do I like this particular staple? I mean, those things change so fast, and there needs to be some consistency, because error rates go down when you have, there's no question, when you have a policy and a procedure that you go through, just like taking an airplane off. We learned that in our operating room, that the more consistent and you could do it, and the more frequently you did it the same way, the less errors there were. But there ought to be some latitude, because not everybody falls under the bell-shaped curve, as Dr. Benechek clearly pointed out, and what you're familiar and use well and have had good success with. So procuring that, and I understand if you got 10 surgeons, the procurement officer in a VA can't procure 10 different types of suture for that, when it really doesn't make any difference on the long-term outcomes, and the data will prove that. And this should be data-driven and not just cost-driven. And I think, unfortunately, what happens a lot of times, these things are cost-driven and not data-driven. I will yield back my time.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe. Mr. Lamborn from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for having this important hearing and for your work on this issue. So I appreciate that. Mr. Williamson, your report noted that the fair and reasonable price determination was not completed for a number of open market purchases that you reviewed and not properly documented in other cases. Does this mean that the VHA was overpaying for surgical implant purchases from the open market?
Not necessarily, but because we didn't look at, again, the cost itself, but we just looked at the documentation that existed to support that. But it does certainly leave, make it more likely the fair and reasonable price wasn't obtained. Even when we examined documentation when there was an explanation, sometimes the explanation wasn't too good. For example, the language might say that it was based on prior prices, and yet the prior prices weren't delineated. So it's just a statement and nothing more. Another case we found, for example, was a case of a bone graft that was supposed to cost $6,000, and the fair and reasonable price determination was based on a price range of other bone grafts that ranged from $3,000 to $20,000. And on the basis of that range, the person determined that the $6,000 bone graft was fair and reasonable. That's probably not the precision that you want in determining that the reasonableness of that $6,000 bone graft. So there, even when the documentation was there, it wasn't very good in many cases.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Butler, I have a question for you. In your testimony, you indicated that the American Legion is utilizing a system worth saving task force. Can you please elaborate on the task force and what it found regarding implant tracking?
Well, in 2003, our past national commander, Ron Connolly, when he was the commander, he went out and visited over 60 VA healthcare facilities, looking at the quality of care and access within the VA healthcare system. As a result of that, at our national convention, a resolution was adopted that the System Worth Saving Task Force continues those site visits. So every year, the American Legion System Worth Task Force identifies a theme. This year, our theme is a 10-year look back at the VA healthcare, where we're visiting 15 VA healthcare facilities, and we're looking at the access, the quality of care that is provided to American veterans. So with regard to your question about what findings we found as it relates to implants, we haven't really focused. That has not been the focus of our attention, but we're beginning to, since this is a part of the hearing, as we go out on our site visits, we're beginning to ask those questions in terms of procurement and so forth, to see what systems and what concerns veterans have. When we go out to a site visit, we have a town hall meeting with veterans, and we bring those veterans in so that they can tell us what are the concerns and the issues they have. So we're asking veterans what concerns, issues they might have, so that we can, when we meet with the medical centers, we can address those intelligently to find to get their response to those issues. So as we're continuing our site visits, we're beginning to focus on those questions.
Okay, I appreciate your work and the American Legion's work on that. And Mr. Williamson, I have a follow-up question. Does open market, quote unquote, mean the possibility that items are not Trade Agreement Act compliant?
Not necessarily. No, I don't think so on that one. If I understand your question right.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get at is there potential that there are gray market products that the VA is using?
There's always, I guess, a potential, although we did not notice that when we did our work.
Okay, appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Williamson, what are the implications of low compliance with waiver requirements for purchasing surgical implants from the open market?
Two things come to mind here. One is an accountability factor. The waiver requirements are there for a reason, to make sure that people go through a thoughtful process, that clinicians go through a thoughtful process when they choose open market items, and that's one factor. The other factor is that the information that VA can glean from waivers has a connection to national contracts, or establishing more national contracts. For example, they get information on high volume, high use items that are being through the waiver process are being purchased on the open market. What that means then is they can use that to identify items that they should pursue under a national contract. So that's a very important part of having good, solid waiver information.
Okay. And Mr. Williams, your report identified shortcomings in VA and VHA oversight of surgical implant purchasing. How do you think that oversight could be improved?
One of the things that both VA and VHA have done separate studies looking at surgical implant purchasing, and came up with basically a number of the same findings that we did. The difficulty was that when they identified those and talked to VAMCs about them, it was more in an advisory category, disclosure category, as opposed to let's do something about it, let's get it done. And one would expect, and what we expect when we recommend something to somebody, is that they come back with an action plan or something of that nature to make sure it happens. And so that's a large part of what we'd like to see.
And Mr. Williamson, finally, your report discussed low compliance with waiver requirements for purchasing surgical implants from the open market. Why were facilities not fully compliant?
There were a couple reasons. As you know, VA is implementing a new system for surgical implants purchases over $3,000. And it's over the last year or so, it's been a major effort with VAMCs across the country. People that we ask in the VAMCs about why didn't you prepare waivers or why aren't these on file told us that the higher priority was to get this new system in place. And that was one of the reasons. Also, as other members have alluded, physicians who practice in VA facilities often have outside practices. They may be part-time, and so they aren't always as familiar with the waiver rules, and that's basically the two reasons that we heard when we asked that question.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson. Ranking Member Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Rowe, I agree with you that we should try to solve this problem within the existing policies that we have. However, Mr. Chairman and the committee, if it's the consensus of the committee that we need a new policy, I think we need to be very careful that we protect that local control. Because, doctors, as you stated, and Dr. Benishek as well, we want our physicians to have the tools that they're comfortable with, because ultimately our goal is the best patient care possible for our veterans. So I think we have to be careful and keep that in mind and give our physicians, men and women, the best tools that are available so that they can deliver the best patient care. That said, I'd like the panel's thought about this idea. When a vendor's rep crosses the line and actually touches a patient in the OR, wouldn't it be more effective just to terminate the contract with the vendor? Terminate the contract.
That's certainly a possibility, and again, if you really want to enforce the idea that vendors have no hands-on treatment ability in VA hospitals, there's got to be some fairly stringent requirements and penalties. I can probably think of a number of things in terms of proving the whole access process for vendors and VAMCs, starting with getting them to sign in at the police office when they arrive. We found, for example, that at one facility we looked at is that the log in the police office for the vendors was supposed to sign in had not been up. The last entry was 2011. So, and we knew that vendors had been in there many times. So there are a number of things in the whole access. It's not just in the operating room or during procedures or whatever. It's the whole access that needs to be changed.
And maybe the procurement process, making sure that those contracts have some clause in there that if a rep actually touches the patient, their contract is terminated. Mr. Butler, do you have any opinion on that?
Well, there may be provisions already in the contract that covers that. They have to look back at the contracts and see specific what the contract states. And I would agree that if there aren't any particular provisions that allow that there needs to be something, because that's a violation of what the veteran consented. The veteran, based upon the current consent form, the veteran did not consent for the vendor to participate in the surgery. So clearly, that's a violation of agreement between the veteran and the clinician.
Right. And my interest is not, again, it's making sure we've got the best patient care possible for our veterans. But let's not make the physician's job more difficult. Let's look at the vendor who actually violated that consent form. Back to the barcode and the tracking. Mr. Williamson, doesn't the VA track medication by barcode already? I mean, isn't there a system?
I believe so, but I'm not sure of that.
Okay. again, I think we should look at what's working in the VA system. I'm pretty sure they track medications. I don't know why they can't track medical devices. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick. Dr. Benishek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, I didn't really touch upon the other issue that we're talking about, and that is the tracking. Some of the other members did, but frankly, I just can't believe that doesn't happen either. I mean, like Dr. Rowe mentioned, I mean, it's been going on in the private sector for 25 years, and constantly with every device that I know of comes with a sticker with a barcode on it, and you put it in the chart, and so that it's thoroughly documented, what device is in which patient, and I just can't believe that this goes on. And it brings me back to my same question I had, and that is the accountability of when these errors occur. What can we do better to identify the people who manage this system and make them accountable for these errors? Any of you have an idea about that?
Well, keep in mind that people, they're looking at a package and there's numbers all over the package, and there can be a very innocent transposition of numbers. It's not something, it may not be done a lot, but it does happen, and there are enough cases where it leads you to have concern about if a recall exists.
Oh, I understand that errors can occur, among the OR scrub nurse or the circulating nurse, but that's uncommon. I mean, and I think a procedure like with a sticker where there's not going to be a transposition numbers because only placing the sticker that came with the device in the patient's chart and in some kind of a hospital tracking system and scanned in the computer, that happens all the time. But making sure that system is in place is somebody's job, and that's what concerns me about the VA in general, is that nobody seems to be accountable for things like this when we bring them up in these committees. I mean, we have issues like this that come up within the VA all the time, and we never get down to whose job it was to do that, and are they getting the right oversight?
That's probably a good question. That's probably a good question for VA. I would think that the IT people should be all over that, but again, I think that's a question that you should address to VA.
Well, I'm going to let Dr. Rowe talk as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Benishek. Ms. Wolarski. Dr. Rowe.
I guess the question that I have now is, we've identified the problems, pretty simple, really. And the question is, what recommendations would you all have? And I agree with Ranking Member Kirkpatrick. You want to make sure that the job I have when I go in the operating room is as easy as possible. I think some of the Dr. Benishek, who's the general surgeon's touchiness about who's accountable, is that he knows who's accountable when they put the knife in his hand. It's him. And he didn't have to look any place but the mirror. And with the VA system, we continually try to find out, well, whose job was it that was to prevent this? I think that's a little bit of your frustration, and mine also. But I guess very simply, what recommendation would you all have for us? This is a fairly simple problem to solve, and we do need these folks. And Ms. Kirkpatrick may have hit on something. You can't go back in the OR. That's a death penalty. I mean, for a vendor, that is the death penalty for them. And that company can't do that. And you do need, when you get these new devices, many of them are procedures, are highly technical. And until you have a real sense of familiarity with them, everybody's going to do their first procedure at some point in time. Whether it may be some variation of what you've been doing. But when new techniques come out, you got to learn those techniques, but somebody's got to be your first one. And, hopefully it goes well, and you need assistance with that. So we don't want to stop that, certainly. But I don't see any reason to ever have a vendor having any hands-on with a patient. I just can't conceive of a situation where you would need to do that. Can you, Dan? I don't either. And so let me yield to you all and give us 2 or 3 things that we need to do, and let's get this done.
Well, with regard to the hands-on treatment of veterans, I think, again, as Mr. Butler said, a national policy or national procedures as a template for the VAMC, so they're not going out doing their own thing, is very important. And so that is, one thing, again, as I said in my opening remarks, we found a variation in inconsistency in that regard. Now, you've heard throughout the question and answers and in my opening remarks the word accountability, and accountability for oversight, accountability for carrying out the waiver and other requirements that go into purchasing. Almost that word goes throughout any of the recommendations we make. You've got to establish accountability and getting people to do what they're supposed to. And it varies as far as who that should be. Sometimes it's the clinicians, sometimes it's the procurement folks. Other cases, it's people in Washington, D.C.
So the policies would be a reliable, repeatable tracking system for any implantable device. Fairly simple technology now should be able to take care of that easily. Number two, there shouldn't be any vendor contact with a direct patient care, I should say, to advise you about how to use a particular piece of technical equipment. That's what they're there for, to turn this device this way. You've seen other surgeons do that. I've certainly used them very successfully in the operating room, but no direct patient contact. And then I think thirdly, the procurement is a little different issue because it does get into, and I do see, like I said, if you've got 10 different surgeons, and we all think we're absolutely right every time, you know that, and that our way is the best way. So I do understand some standardization, but I think at least those two things we could agree on today and implement those things, and I think would solve most of these problems.
That makes sense.
Okay, I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe. Mr. Lamborn, Colorado.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. I have a plant in my district, and I toured it recently, and they do marvelous work creating these amazing implantable devices, anywhere from little pins and screws to large bone grafts, apparatuses, and things like that. And it's just amazing the amount of work and engineering and experience that goes into one of those. And I just think that they have been a wonderful partner in working with the VA and the medical field at large to improve the lives and the prognosis of patients who have all kinds of, and veterans who have all kinds of medical difficulties. So I just want to make sure that no one ends up blaming them, or in case the VA has procedures that need to be improved. So let's don't lose our focus. I mean, this is the VA that we need to have in front of us, and we're really making sure their procedures are up to speed and that the accountability with the VA is what it should be. So I just wanted to make that clarification. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. And I want to thank the panel so much for your testimony. And let's see. And you are now excused. I now invite the second panel to the witness table. Our second panel, we will hear from Mr. Philip Matkovsky, Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Health for Administrative Operations at the Veterans Health Administration. He will be accompanied by Dr. Thomas Lynch, Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Health Clinical Operations at the Veterans Health Administration. Your complete written testimony will be made part of the hearing record. Mr. Matkovsky, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning to discuss the Department of Veterans Affairs practices regarding the use tracking and procurement of surgical implants at VA medical centers. I'm accompanied today by Dr. Thomas.
Make sure that your microphone is on. Could you do that? Is it on?
Perhaps it's not functioning. Can you hear me now?
The light is on, though.
All right. I'm sorry about that. Okay. I'm accompanied today by Dr. Thomas Lynch, Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Health for Clinical Operations. The Veterans Health Administration has made significant changes in the last 3 years to the way we procure surgical implants and prosthetic appliances for veterans. These changes are intended to improve procurement, performance, and accountability while ensuring effective healthcare delivery for veterans. Beginning in fiscal year 2012 and concluding at the end of fiscal year 2013, we transitioned purchasing of surgical implants and prosthetic appliances valued at greater than $3,000 to warranted contracting officers in our procurement organization. VHA's procurement VHA's procurement organization hired and provided specialized training to contracting staff to ensure procurements are properly executed, consistent with both clinical requirements and federal and VA policies and regulations. We believe these changes strengthened our procurement performance. Throughout the transition, our main focus was ensuring orders were completed timely and in concert with clinicians' prescriptions. With the transition now complete, we continue to monitor timeliness and accuracy, and we are now auditing procurement quality and increasing our use of negotiated contracts for sourcing implants and prosthetic appliances. As a result of the transition, our acquisitions above micro-purchase limits are now recorded in ECMS, our contract management system, and the Federal Procurement Data System. Our quality audits of these procurements have led to changes in procedures and ordering templates as well. Continuous QA reviews will begin in this fiscal quarter to provide detailed oversight of our ordering process. These reviews will focus on sourcing practices and will be used to improve our utilization of existing national contracts, improve training, and identify further opportunities to place biologics and implants on additional contracts. In FY 2014, we'll evaluate establishment of competed additional national contracts that will be directly informed by our clinical leadership to ensure we're emphasizing clinical quality, patient safety, and value. VHA is currently updating and finalizing our policy for prosthetics procurement. Once promulgated, this new directive will provide comprehensive and clear guidance to VA medical center staff on how to order prosthetics. We are still reviewing the recently released GAO report on surgical implants. Prior to receiving the GAO report, VA had initiated a number of reforms to acquisition. Any further opportunities identified by GAO to enhance our acquisition procedures will be considered in our ongoing process. The presence of vendors in the operating room is a common practice in healthcare settings. There are broadly accepted professional standards pertaining to the presence of vendors in operating rooms from the American College of Surgeons and the American Medical Associations. Physicians use professional judgment to determine when the presence of a vendor in a clinical setting improves the safety and effectiveness of patient care. Currently, VA is working, however, to develop overarching policy regarding the role of vendors. VHA Handbook 1004-01, entitled Informed Consent for Clinical Treatments and Procedures, requires physicians obtain patient signature on a consent form before undertaking specific procedures such as surgery. This policy requires physicians discuss the contents of this form with patients. The form also states that under certain circumstances, the presence of a vendor is important to the success of the procedure. That prior to the procedure, the vendor will sign an agreement to strictly adhere to VA's privacy rules, that the vendor may provide technical advice but will not physically participate in the procedure, and that the vendor will be closely monitored by the VA treatment team. VHA additionally has a comprehensive recall process that is triggered both by our own facilities as well as external notices such as the FDA. This process is overseen by our National Center for Patient Safety, which monitors all recall actions requiring product removal from inventory and coordination with patients. At the facility level, all surgical implants are required to be tracked. Further, for certain implantable devices such as pacemakers, vendors are additionally required to ensure medical device tracking to the patient level so that individuals may be contacted in the event of a recall or problem with the device they received. When a recall is initiated, VHA follows a step-by-step process that begins with removing affected products from our inventory, and that further ensures all mandated actions are closed out to 100% complete. This process then moves to identifying patients. notifying patients, monitoring patients, and in certain cases performing clinical follow-up with patients. When recalls do occur, we also work with vendors to ensure all VA patients involved have been identified. Mr. Chairman, we appreciate your support and encouragement in identifying and addressing issues regarding the procurement of surgical implants at VA medical centers. My colleague, Dr. Lynch, and I are prepared to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony. Right. Easy on one. Dr. Lynch, was VHA aware of vendor representatives providing direct patient care at VA MCs?
We were not aware until the GAO report was issued.
Okay. Mr. Matkowski, what does VA see as an appropriate role for vendor representatives in the procedure area, be it in the OR, wound care clinic, or any other setting?
We do not see it as providing direct patient treatment. I would indicate that in this one case, after we found out from the GAO report, we did refer this case to our Office of Inspector General ourselves. Consultation support, particular technical advice regarding new technical implants is permissible, but direct patient engagement is not.
Mr. Matkowski, what % of biologic contracts are made on the federal supply schedule and the open market?
We've looked at a couple of these, sir. One of them, looking at the below threshold, so contract actions below $3,000, we have about 70% of those actions are on contracts, so national contracts, regional contracts. In addition, for the biologics, I believe there were about $75 million of acquisitions in fiscal year 13. We have not broken out separately those that were on contract, not on contract, but I believe in the first quarter of FY14, our number is roughly about 40% on national contracts, sir.
Okay. I'd very much like you to provide that breakdown to the committee within 2 weeks. Thank you. Ranking Member Kirkpatrick.
Mr. Matkowski, I appreciate that the VA is working on policies regarding vendors in the OR. I think the concern of this committee is always what's the consequence of violating a policy of the VA. What's your thought about terminating the contract with the vendor whose rep actually touches the patient?
Not to be evasive, Congresswoman, but in this case, we would have to look at it. If they violated the terms of a contract, then an appropriate action would be to terminate their contract with the VA. But at a minimum, they would have performed something in violation of our policy. The difference there would be if it's a quality product, a product that we have on a committed use contract, would we want to terminate a contract nationally for the actions of one vendor? But it's something we would want to monitor very closely.
And well, I just want to reiterate, the concern of the committee is that a lack of consequences, good policies, but a lack of consequence if the policy is breached. But let me go on to the second point. The GAO report states that the Program Executive Office identifies items that are frequently used and high cost. This implies that is the only mechanism for identifying items to be included in these contracts. Is that in fact the case?
That is not the only mechanism, it's one of the mechanisms. And I have some numbers for our Program Executive Office. It really took effect in FY13. By the end of fiscal year 13, I was directly involved in setting some of the performance goals for that organization and had tied my accountability directly to that success. By the end of the fiscal year, in fiscal year 13, there were roughly 113, I think, packages developed by that group. Total life cycle value of those packages in excess of $2.1 billion estimated. What they do is they look at our procurement spend in something we call MedPDB, the Medical Product Database that we share with DoD. And we look at the things we buy, and where we don't have items on national contract, we identify them as opportunities. That is one mechanism. It's not the only mechanism. Another mechanism we use as we transitioned away, I just want to emphasize, in a period of about 18 months, we removed 1,100 contracting officer warrants from prosthetic staff and transitioned that to procurement staff. we now have about 378 prosthetics contracts at a regional and local level that we didn't have before. Those total in a value annual of $323 million. So that's a mechanism that allows us to do bottom-up. I believe you had made the comment about top-down versus bottom-up, where clinician preference is indicated and we can find it in buying patterns. We had hoped that this transition would allow us to identify those spend patterns as it moves into contracting, and then contracting would establish local and regional contracts, and then subsequently we would establish national contracts. We are evaluating a biologics contract. It's going to be a complex contract, but that would be a national committed use contract like we have with stents.
Could you, oh, excuse me.
Sorry, Mr. Mikoski, can you please speak a little closer to the microphone? Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
And could you provide the committee with the performance goals and metrics for that
I will.
system? Last question is, you heard Dr. Rose say that the medical devices are changing at light speed. And what's your system for testing new devices and then introducing them to the VA system at large?
I'm going to defer to Dr. Lynch for some of this, but part of our evaluation process that we run with the Program Executive Office, frankly, the OAL National Acquisition Center for a number of years had helped VHA in some of this work. We get product samples from the vendor community, so clinicians who are a member of our selection team are literally evaluating products as part of that process. That's different than the federal supply schedule mechanism, which is a much more top-down approach, not negating the value of either. But it would be direct testing of the product offering on the part of clinicians. And then I'll defer to Dr. Lynch for the research and evaluation of new technologies.
Let me just try and comment a little bit about the introduction of new technology and the process. I think Congressman Rowe and Congressman Benishek discussed that earlier. The VA does, in fact, have a very rigid process of credentialing and introducing new products into the VA. So physicians are expected to undergo specific training. This is actually specified in our credentialing process. When they actually begin to do the process, if appropriate, they will do it under supervision for a period of time before they are credentialed to perform it widely without supervision. So I think we have a process that's very similar to that discussed by Congressman Rowe in terms of introducing new procedures and assuring that there's competence on the part of the physician to perform that procedure.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick. Dr. Benishek?
Well, that's a great statement there you made, Dr. Lynch, about rigorous rules for credentialing, but something is wrong, right? Because I mean, some vendors were doing cases, so there's obviously these guys weren't credentialed to be doing cases in the OR, so that there's a failure there somewhere, right?
Let me.
You would agree that there's been a failure if this actually occurred like has been described.
I absolutely agree that a vendor should not be touching a patient. The GAO did not share the specifics of this case with us. We have done some background. We think we understand what happened and where it happened. It did not happen in the operating room. It happened outside of the operating room. It happened during the course of a dressing change. It was not a skin graft. It was a skin substitute, one of the cryopreserved skin covers that are used for wound care. And it did not involve a physician. We believe it involved a mid-level provider. We have asked our Office of Medical Inspector to go in and evaluate that. Regardless of where it occurred and regardless of the circumstances, let me be very clear, it should not have occurred. But we do not believe that it occurred in the operating room at this time.
I see. Okay. Well, I'm not privy to the details either. So, I mean, obviously we need to get that done.
But I just wanted to be very clear that this does not appear to have been an event that occurred in the OR while a patient was asleep or while a patient was under anesthesia.
All right. Well, I guess those facts will have yet to come out. It's just that I want to touch again on the accountability part. You know what I mean? How many people are in your department, Mr. Lynch? I mean, you're Dr. Lynch, you're the Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Health clinical operations. So either, I mean, how many people do you have working for you?
Directly, I have about 15. Indirectly, because of the 151 care centers that I oversee, we probably have between 100 to 150,000 people working for us, sir.
You know, that to me is I'm trying to get to. I mean, I think we've identified the fact that there's problems here that shouldn't have happened. My issue is that, and you've heard me say that if you listen to the previous testimony, I have difficulty with the fact that we never seem to identify a person who's responsible for the follow-up. And I'm going to tout my legislation. You know, I've got this this VA Accountability Act, which would actually make the VA identify somebody within the VA who's responsible for something that didn't occur, for example, to an Inspector General report. Okay, so that there's actual accountability by a manager if they didn't comply with an IG report. So, do you ever write performance reviews on any of these people that work for you?
I write the performance reviews for the people who report to me directly, yes, sir. So, every year then everybody gets a performance review written out? My direct reports, not for everybody across VHA, but
no, but I mean those 15 people that you talked about.
Yes.
And those 15 people each have 15 people until you get to the 115,000.
Correct.
You're talking about.
Correct.
From my position here, it's tough to get the bureaucracy the size that you're talking about with 150,000 people somewhere below you in the chain of command to get those individuals in performance to improve, because whenever we ask for the name of the person who is responsible for fixing this, we don't get a name of a person. We get a vague answer. We can never get down to improving people's performance within the bureaucracy. Do you understand what I'm kind of getting to?
I understand your frustration. I think, though, you've practiced medicine as I have, and I think you also appreciate the complexity of medicine and the interaction between individuals, processes, and policies that sometimes make it difficult to separate accountability from the person and the process. And I think that's a challenge we face. We need to identify people who need to have remediation of some form. We also need to be able to identify where our processes and our policies interfere with our people performing good service.
Have you ever written a review that recommended remediation or performance improvement?
I have put several individuals on a performance improvement plan, yes, sir.
But nobody ever lost their job or been transferred in that circumstance of those 15 people?
I have not fired anybody or transferred anybody, no, sir.
And how long have you been in the position?
I've been in this position for about a year.
Okay.
I've worked in the VA for about 35 years, sir.
Well, I admire your service to our veterans. I really have a problem with this, and I hope that the remainder of the staff, we got this Patient Accountability Act through the committee, but I was hoping that you all will tell our colleagues on the floor to consider voting for this Patient Accountability Act so we can improve the accountability of people in the VA. I find it very frustrating, Dr. Lynch, about how the performance is. I guess I'm way over my time. Sorry.
Ms. Wolarski, Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Makovsky, we've learned in the testimony from the previous panel and then also just here, each VA hospital has its own healthcare industry representative credentialing program. We know that. And requirements, often creating discrepancies in both the requirements and the enforcement from hospital to hospital. And you may have alluded to this in your opening remarks, but I couldn't hear you real well. Could you give us an update on where the VA is in establishing a single standardized credentialing program for use across the system? And I would direct your attention to what's being considered right now in my state, in the state of Indiana, with the Indiana Hospital Association. It has the potential to create more consistent enforcement compliance. After that GAO report, can you just give us an update? Where are you in coming up with a centralized program?
Sure.
I would separate the credentialing and privileging question with the vendor policy.
Mm-hmm.
And quite frankly, we agree with Mr. Williamson and Mr. Butler that a national policy would help here, and that policy sets the guideline, and then from that, the local policies would be derived. We've just begun, so I can't give you a specific timeline, but at the direction of the Undersecretary, he wants us to look at this and establish some form of national guidance.
Okay, and then also, as Mr. Lamborn alluded to, the VA is a very important customer partner for the medical device industry. Since the implementation of the medical device tax a year ago, has the VA seen any negative impact in terms of VA patient access or access to existing or any new technologies, and is there a concern going forward about access or new technologies as it pertains to the cost of the medical device tax?
I don't know that I have the specifics on the cost factor. Some of the cost would probably be built into the actual provided price to us, but I don't have those details. I can get those and come back. We have not seen any negative effect at this point to access to medical devices.
Could you provide that to the committee?
We will.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lamborn, Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this question is for either one of you. According to the GAO report that we just heard from, and I quote, "A physician who stated that vendor representatives were present during the application of skin grafts at this VA medical center told us that he did not know what the official vendor policy was at the VA medical center, and that he was not aware of a VA medical center policy that addresses vendor roles. It sounds to me like the oversight by VA is lacking when physicians have not been informed and made aware of VA policy. What are you doing as an overseer within the VA to make sure this never happens again?"
I think we can do this as a two-part. First of all, we went back and looked at all of the medical centers to verify that we have policy. We do have policy across the board. In this instance, this is an individual who, the one that we were looking at, there was in fact a policy, and it was a violation of local policy. I would further, with Congresswoman Walorski's comment in my response there, that we will be looking at a national policy. Part of the benefit of a national policy is that it has certain enforcement authority that gets carried with that as well. So the national policy will set the frame, local policies will derive from that, training will be associated with those policies. I agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Butler that that actually is a sound practice. That is what we're doing at this point.
And Doctor, do you have anything to add to that?
I would reinforce what Mr. Matkowski said. I would also emphasize that we've asked our Office of Medical Inspector to go in to help us understand why the failure occurred so that we can prevent it from happening again.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Dr. Rowe, Tennessee.
And Dr. Lynch, thank you for your 35 years of medical service to our veterans. I think this is, at least I hope that this situation is just an outlier that occurred, and at least I'm beginning to think that it is. I was reading, it's very clear in the VA policy where VA hospitals are teaching facilities, which is great, and trainees may participate in or observe in this treatment/procedure. In certain circumstances, the presence of a vendor representative, a company representative, is important in the success of the procedure. That's true. Prior to the procedure, the representative will sign an agreement to strictly adhere to VA privacy rules. And obviously that policy wasn't followed in this circumstance that Mr. Lamborn talked about. The representative may provide technical advice but will not physically participate in the procedure. That's very clear. The representative will be closely monitored by the VA treatment team. I mean, that's pretty clear policy to me. That's not hard to understand.
I think VA's position is very clear. I think the AMA and the American College of Surgeons have reinforced that position. And like Congressman Benishek, I've spent many years in the operating room. I have never seen a vendor representative scrub on a case. I have seen them there for technical information. I have seen them there for calibration of equipment that is placed. I have never witnessed a vendor representative scrub. I think this was an outlier, but I think it emphasizes the importance of understanding why it occurred so we can assure it doesn't happen again.
I 100% agree with that, and I think your evaluation, Dr. Lynch, is correct. Secondly, the tracking system, I think, is something that is not a major obstacle with today's technology. It should be fairly simple. Could you elaborate on that?
I can tell you what we're doing in what I think are several best practices in VA right now. Any implant that is placed in the operating room in a VA hospital, not only is there a sticker placed in the chart, as Congressman Benishek recommended or noted, but that information is also placed in the patient's electronic medical record by the circulating nurse at the time of the procedure. So there is, in fact, a redundant system. Not only do we have information in the prosthetic system, but we have information in CPRS, the patient information.
If you had as you know, a number of years ago, there was a new ceramic hip that fractured. One of my, he didn't think it was so funny, neither did his mother. He put in his own mother. I would have never done that. I wouldn't touch my mother with a 10-foot pole, but anyway, he did, and well, she thought, yes.
Would it be too demanding for you, Congressman?
But anyway, it fractured, and he had a way, because of the tracking system, to be able to get this out and replace it.
We actually,
system, do you have that available now? Is that up and running and we just don't know about it?
We have a process in place that's run through our National Center for Patient Safety. Any recalls that are issued are processed by the National Center for Patient Safety. They have representatives at the visit and facility level that they contact when there is a recall. 2 steps happen depending upon the nature of the recall. The material is removed from the shelf, so it can't be placed. And if it's need be, we identify the patients through the prosthetics package and the operative record and notify the patients of the recall and what steps may be taken to follow them with that implant. In most cases, a hip or a pacemaker, it's usually not removed, but the patients follow it more closely.
How long does that take?
I can't tell you.
Because I know the VA dropped the ball big time on 4 or 5 years. I guess it was almost 5 years ago. We talked about the colonoscopies and identifying patients, and the VA records. There was a huge drop ball there. Are we sure? Do you have systems in place to be sure that my lens implant doesn't? There's a recall that I'm notified.
I'm comfortable that we have good systems, Congressman. I can't guarantee you that there might not be exceptions. There are always exceptions in healthcare, but I'm confident that we have good systems. I also feel that we can improve those systems. We can make them better by using some of the technology that we've developed, as the ranking member mentioned, in terms of barcoding for medication. We also barcode for transfusions. We need to look at some of the newer technology associated with RTLS and barcoding to see if we can improve the efficiency of that system. But I'm confident that in the majority of cases we can identify the individual and assure the provider and the patient that they have appropriate information regarding.
There have been some whopping failures that I've observed since I've been here. One, if you'll indulge me just a minute, one final question. The procedures and techniques or new devices, I should say, that are tested by our VA physicians, are they being added to the federal supply schedule or not? I mean, are they purchased on open market purchases?
2 answers to that. They would be more likely to go into a national contract or a committed use contract right now than an FSS. The FSS is somewhat vendor driven, so the vendor will come and get itself on the schedule listing for the most part. But we have a team, I had mentioned it before, it's broken into a number of different domains, a prosthetics domain, surgery domain, nursing, you name it, and looks at our spend pattern and then moves things into committed use contracts through that process.
Ken, I thank you. I yield back. I thank you for indulging me.
Thank you, Dr. O. Mr. Matkowski, recently VA unilaterally deleted Biologic from VA's federal supply schedule contracts, then did an immediate about-face by putting them back on schedule. Was this related to the lawsuit filed against VA on this issue?
Mr. Chairman, I do not have information on that, if I can take that one for the record.
Very well. Dr. Lynch, vendors performing operations on veterans is not only a serious breach of VA protocol, but also violates the veterans' privacy and thereby HIPAA. In accordance with VA's table of penalties, at a minimum, will VA be holding anyone accountable for these failures?
Mr. Chairman, I can't comment on that right now. It's under investigation. I think we'll have a better idea of the nature of accountability once we understand what happened. But if appropriate, people will be held accountable.
Mr. Matkowski, you issued a memorandum on May 23rd, 2012, underscoring VHA policy on the purchase of biologics that for the past year and a half has been blatantly disregarded by VHA employees. Are you concerned that your guidance is completely ignored without any repercussions, or was the memo just a hollow attempt to say that you did something to address this continued failure to follow the law in our hearing in 2012?
No, sir. I do not believe it was a hollow attempt. I thought we had started. At the same time, from May 23rd, 2012 to September 30th, 2013, we removed all of the warrants from our prosthetic staff to be able to purchase above the $3,000 level. That was a significant transition for us. Much of our energy went into making sure we got that right. One of the big concerns we had at the time, and when we testified at that hearing, the hearing before that, and then the subsequent hearing, my big concern, frankly, was the timeliness effect of that transition. We would be transitioning the purchasing of a prosthetic appliance with a vendor waiting on the other side of the transaction. So to complete that, most of our energy went into that. Now we're looking at the procurement compliance. Our audits are looking at the appropriate determination of the justification for other than full and open. If we're using 8123 incorrectly, our audits will pick that up now, and we'll make sure we're compliant, sir.
Ranking Member Kirkpatrick.
Reading here. I appreciate your efforts in crafting a national policy, but I just want to remind you that my district in Arizona is a huge rural district. It's bigger than the state of Pennsylvania, covers over half the state, and it's unique in that we do have a lot of rural veterans. We also have 25% of the population Native American, and you know, I'm always concerned about a one-size-fits-all excuse me, policy, and I'd just like to know how you're addressing the unique challenges and needs of our rural veterans and our Native American veterans.
Let me take a first crack at that. We're a little bit off topic because I think once we move into rural areas, we're not talking about surgical procedures or probably even the involvement of vendors, but we are talking about providing services to veterans. And I think the VA has taken the lead in telehealth as a means for delivering care, what I would term to be point of residence, where the patient is. And I think we've made great strides in developing mechanisms by which we can treat and interact with patients remotely and provide rural veterans the same quality of service that veterans are getting in our larger facilities. It began in primary care. I think we're now able to deliver specialty care services. We have the ability to use stethoscopes and other remote monitoring equipment so that I think we are being concerned about the rural veteran. I came from Omaha, Nebraska. Our area covered about 70 to 80,000 square miles of western Iowa and Nebraska. We faced some of the same challenges, and we found the use of telehealth very effective in delivering that care. VA is actually now looking at newer models which will deliver care directly into the patient's homes by connecting physician and patient across the internet so that they can interface directly in the home. So I think we are concerned about the rural veteran. We are concerned about the veteran that can't make our facilities, and I think we do have some tools to provide that care.
In my district, you know, one of my concerns is though communication between the VA hospitals and those rural veterans and Native American veterans, especially if you've got a device recall. So just hope that you'll keep that in the forefront of your minds as you go through the development of the policy. My other question is really, excuse me, process. The GAO report indicated that in 2011, the VHA established a program management office for prosthetics to identify additional surgical implants that could be made available excuse me, through national committed use contracts. However, an official told the GAO that the office was unable to focus on developing national committed use contracts because of staffing constraints. So would you explain to the committee how the office is supposed to function? Where in the organizational structure of VA is it located, VHA? Does it have the necessary staffing and financial resources to make a difference and improve the process? And do you believe this office is capable of performing the duties you have assigned to it?
That office is located in VHA's corporate office in what we call Patient Care Services. The National Program Director is on board. I think that program is running very well. There's a really strong collaboration between prosthetics now, logistics, and contracting. We attend concurrent meetings every Friday afternoon. We're reviewing the prosthetics order timeliness and accuracy. The committed use contracts, I gave a number very quickly. But at the below $3,000 threshold, these are the transactions that are micro purchases, typically done on a purchase card by prosthetic staff. 70% of those transactions are against contracts. In excess of 60% of the dollar value of those are against contracts. Those will increase. Mr. Chairman, in further response to your comment about the memo from 2012, we've seen an increase, although not where we would like it to be, in the use of waivers, and we have to do a better job communicating that requirement to the clinical community. Also, just to make sure people don't think of it as a punitive action, but as an informative action to let us know what else we need to get on contract. I think it's actually a really functioning partnership at this point, and the leadership team's doing a great job.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Lynch, I have a couple more questions about, I know you responded to Dr. Rowe's question about the tracking, and you said, you know, we were informed about this VITAS system, Veterans Implant Tracking and Alert System, apparently which was in the process of development. I mean, can you elaborate on what that was, and what is the mechanism? Are we not using that, or what is the mechanism that you're using that you answered Dr. Rowe's question in the affirmative? How does that work?
First of all, VITAS was an attempt to integrate the systems we have that track implants. It was conceived and during initial implementation, evaluation was not found to be functioning properly. So at the moment we have pulled that back. We're relying on the National Center for Patient Safety, who tracks recalls. We're relying on their interface with our networks and facilities. We have patient safety managers at each of our facilities who work with the National Center for Patient Safety to receive the recall, assure that any shelf product is immediately removed, and then work with the facility and its databases to identify any patients who may have had a particular implant placed, so that we can inform the patient and the provider and be sure appropriate actions are being taken.
Has this actually occurred under your tenure there? Have you seen anything like that happen that you're aware of?
It has occurred seamlessly. There have been, I think, about 46 recalls over the past year that have been mediated by the National Center for Patient Safety. I can't itemize those for you. 13 of those involved biologics. They were all biologics that were placed in the OR, so we should have record of the implantation.
So then that information goes to each individual medical center, and then they, from their list of patients, figure out if they've done any of those implants?
They would go back and review the appropriate record to see if any of those were implanted in a patient, and then link that implant to a patient, yes.
So, you know how, does that take a long time then, or I mean, is it done on computers? Is that?
The search is done by computers, yes.
All right.
And it's also tracked on a website. So, you know, an internal system, National Center for Patient Safety will issue an alert, goes to a patient safety officer at the VISN who oversees the patient safety officer at the facility. And depending upon the criticality of the alert notice, there's a requirement to have 100% compliance by a given date. And that date is set by the criticality of the alert.
And there's a requirement that the medical center communicate with the National Center for Patient Safety to indicate that the appropriate action has been taken.
Well, I don't know, I just got this answer here. In response to your answer, apparently there was a source from saying that the National Center for Patient Safety does not track biologics.
The National Center for Patient Safety does not specifically track the product. The facility does. The National Center for Patient Safety, however, does track the recall notices for biologics and does pass them through to the network and the facility when appropriate.
All right, well, I'm just...
In fact, there were 13 recalls within, I believe, the past year that did relate to biologics that were managed by the National Center for Patient Safety.
All right, well, that's contradictory to somebody else's answer at a previous date, apparently. So
I think the distinction is that at the National Center for Patient Safety, they're not keeping the list of the individual patient and the implant of that patient. That is not NCPS's charge. It's their charge to link to the FDA, find an incident report from a medical center, and then trigger the recall action, set the goal, measure compliance. The tracking is done both in CPRS and in the prosthetics GUI that will track that. So there are policies that require us to record the serial number and associate that with the individual patient.
Right, and I think, and just to interject for a second, what we've had as testimony and certainly evidence in the GAO analysis is that you are not effectively tracking this information, and that is a problem for patient safety. Dr. Benishek, please proceed.
Actually, I'm pretty much out of time here, so thank you.
Ms. Wolarski, Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rakowski, I just wanted to ask a follow-up on the issue of the medical device tax. The reason I'm asking that question, the reason I'm concerned about it, and I've repeatedly asked the question of the VA, is because we've had complaints in my district, which is in northern Indiana, of long waits for medical devices, hips, knees, veterans even asking if they can, why the VA can't refer them to private hospitals, refer them to somebody else, get them the treatment because of enduring pain. And I posed the question to the VA way back in April of last year of saying, what is this impact going to be? Is there going to be an access issue? Which I've never received an answer on, but from what I'm hearing in my district there is potentially an access issue. And the other question I have was on this issue of funding. And I re-asked the question to the VA back in November on the committee, and somebody was here representing the VA, and they said they'd get back to us, and they never did. I've never had an answer in 60 days. And the reason I'm reposing the question is to you today, especially because you're here testifying on this specific issue that we're talking about. When can you give me, even if the VA's answer is that the dollar value is minimal, all I want is the dollar figure the VA assigns to the medical device impact. When can I get that dollar figure that you guys are assessing to the medical device impact? Can you tell, because my fear is if I walk out of here today and I don't have some kind of an agreement with the VA today, I've waited 60 days, even put the request in writing, and we still don't have an answer. When can you provide me the answer?
I would say roughly within 30 days. We do a forecast out for the prosthetic spend that we perform, and we're getting better at forecasting that amount. It's going to be somewhat challenging. I mean, we'll have to look at how much the device tax costs and then do some extrapolation on that. But I would say give us 30 days.
So I guess my response to that is I've given the VA 60 days and no response, both verbally and in writing. Can you provide me with that information by the end of the week, by tomorrow, 5 o'clock?
I want to do a good job and make sure we get it done right.
But my concern is nobody's answered the question. We've done everything here, and the complaints that I am receiving from veterans who are waiting for these products has to lead me to believe if there is an access problem in my district, is there also a dollar value problem with funds available to the VA, and is there an economic impact? So my concern is because of the fact that veterans are complaining and the pain that they are in the meantime, and the issue of asking to even go to private hospitals, to go elsewhere, well, asking if the VA would reassign them.
I will personally commit to you that I will make sure we get this answer to you. I've been saying 30 days. We have some concurrence processes and other things that I need to go through, so I can't necessarily commit those timelines, but I will make sure we get it done.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thanks to the panel, you are now excused. Today we have had a chance to hear about many deficiencies present in VA's handling, tracking, and procurement of surgical implants. I'm not convinced that VA has taken the appropriate steps to correct these problems, especially considering how many of them were addressed in similar hearings this subcommittee held nearly 2 years ago. This lack of progress on the part of VA is unacceptable. As such, this hearing was necessary to accomplish a number of items. Number one, to discover the extent of VA inappropriately allowing vendors to participate in hands-on surgical procedures. Two, to address the absence of an operational tracking system that would allow VA to determine what implants were administered to veterans in case of an emergency. Three, to identify the reasoning and effects of VA's failure to procure biological implants on the federal supply schedule, as well as its rampant and incorrect use of waivers. Four, to require VA officials to explain their inadequate response to these serious problems and determine what steps, if any, are being taken to correct them. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Without objection, I would like to thank again all of our witnesses and audience members for joining in today's conversation. With that, this hearing is adjourned.